So, chapter 3. I bet in the last episode you were wondering what might happen with Mr. Jasper Milvain. You probably were considering Alex Ryder. Why were there two of them fighting on the roof? Was he going to get found out? Mr. Bray seems like a good egg, the headmaster of the school at Brooklands, but can he keep Alex safe? All of these questions were going through my mind as I was reading chapter 2. So let's see in chapter 3 what happens. Like everyone else, we are still on chapter 2. Like everyone else at Brookland that day, Alex was not looking forward to missing class in order to stand in the schoolyard listening to some politician lecturing them from behind a microphone. Ever since MI6 had entered his life, he'd missed enough school anyway. First, there'd been a visit to Sale Enterprises down in Cornwall and his encounter with the deadly Stormbreaker computers. And just when he thought it was all over, he'd been packed off to France, pretending to be the son of the billionaire businessman called Dr. Friend. That had also been a near-death experience with Dr. Grief, which had not ended well. As he walked out of the dining hall following lunch, he felt a strong twinge of guilt. Nobody in the school knew what he'd been through in the past month, working reluctantly for MI6. That was part of his new world that he most disliked, having to lie to his friends. Nor could he tell anyone that he was at least partly responsible for the destruction of the science block. Julius Grief had wanted to kill him, and he would cheerfully have burned down the entire school to achieve his aim. Like it or not, it was Alex who'd brought him here. And now he was having to join 3-year groups to listen to some local politician boasting about his achievements. Alex was fed up with politics. It often seemed to him that there was as noisy and as rude as half the people he saw in Parliament. He would be thrown out of school without a second thought. He'd seen Jasper Milvain on TV, angrily wangling his finger at a crowd of climate change protesters, absolutely convinced that he knew more than the world scientists. Alex wasn't looking forward to this afternoon. At least we're missing history, said Tom Harris, his best friend at Brookland. He must have been reading his mind. He'd caught up with him in the corridor. I like history, Alex replied. It's just wars and people killing each other and kings and queens. I mean, who cares if the Spanish Armada took place in 1688? Actually, I think it was 1588. Exactly my point. What difference does it make? Alex wasn't in the mood to argue anyway. Just then they were interrupted by a tall, curly-haired man who was coming the other way, pushing between them. Alex had met him a couple of times. His name was Kevin Doyle, a supply teacher who'd only been at Brooklands a few months. He was working in the English department and volunteered to direct the school play. This year it was going to be Macbeth, and Tom had been cast as the porter. Mr. Doyle looked miserable, sweating in a jacket that was too warm for the weather and carrying a bulging backpack. He was obviously in a hurry, but still stopped and turned to the two boys. Harris, I hope you've learned your lines now. I'm working on them, sir. For heaven's sake, Harris, you've only got one scene. He turned to Alex. I'm very disappointed in you, Ryder. You didn't even audition. While the auditions had been taking place, Alex had been in France, being chased down the ski slopes by men on 700cc snowmobiles with built-in machine guns. He didn't tell the teacher that. Maybe next year, he said, if I'm here next year. Doyle took out a handkerchief and wiped his forehead. Then he continued on his way. The two boys watched him go. What's wrong with him? He looks scared to death. Maybe he's seen your acting, Alex said. Half an hour later, over 200 children streamed out of the school and took their places on the side of the schoolyard, facing the podium, where Milvain would speak. When the politician addressed them, he would have his back to the library and the fenced-off, soon-to-be-rebuilt science block would be right in front of him. The whole event could have been staged deliberately, and probably had been. The politician was not yet outside. He was having a coffee with the head teacher, but half a dozen press journalists and a camera crew stood waiting. Others were going on their business as if nothing unusual was happening. The crane was hoisting a short steel girder up towards the roof. A couple of engineers were in discussion with the site foreman, and the hammering and the pneumatic drill was occasionally interrupted in short bursts somewhere inside. Two heavy-set security guards stood on either side of the gate, watching the crowd carefully. Alex joined his friends standing in orderly lines, and everyone was dressed in their best school uniform. Mr. Bray had made an announcement at assembly the day before. No crooked ties, no shirts outside trousers, no trainers. Everyone had to look their best. Not for Jasper Milvain, but for the school. At least the weather was good. The sun was shining and there was a light breeze. The only thing missing was the MP. He often behaved this way. The longer he kept people waiting, the more impressive his entrance would be. Several Brookland teachers were in the yard keeping an eye on things, but even they didn't complain when students began to fidget and talk amongst themselves. They probably wanted the whole thing to be over too. Alex would generally have been preferred to be doing history. He glanced through the fence at the burnt-out building surrounded by scaffolding and thought about the clone that was searching for him, his face twisted with anger, the gun, the flames. He felt uncomfortable being here. He just wanted to go home. And then he saw something. A man had come out of the plastic cabin on the edge of the construction site. He was dressed like the other workers, blue overalls, fluorescent vest, a brightly coloured helmet. If he'd simply continued forward, Alex might not have noticed him, but he hesitated, looking left and right as if he was checking that he hadn't been seen, and that made him stand out. A moment later he began walking, but now Alex had him in his sights and he noticed something else. The man had the wrong shoes. Alex had been on building sites before. In fact, there was on his journey to the Point Blank Academy had begun, coming up against 2 drug dealers in Putney Bridge. He knew that everyone on a building site had to wear safety boots with steel toe caps and reinforced soles. The man who was making his way across site, keeping his head low and trying not to be seen, was wearing loafers. What did this mean? Just then a door opened at the side of the school and Jasper Milvain walked out next to the head teacher, Henry Bray. He'd got 2 protection officers with him and several advisors, and he waved cheerfully to the crowd. Before speaking, he waited for the applause to stop. In fact, there was no applause. I imagine he thought it in his head. "Good afternoon," he said. The man on the building site had disappeared. Alex briefly glanced at the visiting politician and then he turned his back. There was no sign of him. And suddenly he knew that danger was close. He didn't have evidence, just the way the man hesitated and the fact he was wearing ordinary shoes. But if there was one thing that his uncle had taught him, sometimes instinct was enough. The spies who hesitated, who waited for absolute proof before they took action, were easily recognised, the dead ones. "Alex, what are you?" Tom called out to him, but he was already too late. Alex had broken away from the side of the yard towards the fence. He might be wrong. He might be making a fool of himself, but he was determined to find out what was going on.